When Sundar Pichai shared his father's lesson, Narendra Modi smiled with respect. The air in the hall was heavy with silence, yet it carried the weight of anticipation. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on the stage where Sundar Pichai stood, his posture calm but his eyes thoughtful. The lights were bright, but Sundar seemed lost in a memory that pulled him far away from the present moment. The audience did not yet know that what he was about to share was not a story of technology or success, but something much deeper, something that would touch the heart of even the Prime Minister sitting in the front row. He cleared his throat gently, not in nervousness, but as if preparing himself to let go of a truth he had carried for years. "When I was a boy," he began slowly, his voice soft yet steady, "my father taught me something that I could never forget. It was not about business, it was not about money, it was not even about studies. It was about respect." A few people shifted in their seats, sensing the change in tone. This was not going to be an ordinary speech filled with achievements. Sundar's words felt personal, and that kind of honesty always holds people tight, refusing to let them look away. "We did not have much," Sundar continued. "Our home was simple, small, and sometimes life felt heavy. But my father always said, if you lose everything in life, never lose your respect for others, and never lose your kindness. Because when people remember you, they will not remember how much money you made, but how you made them feel." The hall fell into complete stillness. No coughs, no whispers, just the soft sound of his words echoing against the walls. Narendra Modi leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Sundar, a faint smile forming as though he already knew where this was going. He too came from a world where values mattered more than wealth, where lessons of humility were stronger than lessons of pride. Sundar paused, and in that pause lay the suspense. What had happened in his childhood that made those words more than just a teaching? He let the silence stretch, holding the audience in suspense, then spoke again. "One day I was angry," Sundar said, his voice dipping lower. "I had been mocked by older boys who said I would never achieve anything. I came home with tears in my eyes. I wanted to prove them wrong. I wanted to shout at them, to fight back. But my father sat beside me and asked me to listen. He said, 'Sundar, you can answer them in two ways, with anger or with respect. Anger will give you only one moment of satisfaction, but respect will give you a lifetime of dignity.'" The audience shifted, many with their own memories flashing before their eyes. Who had not faced a moment like that, where pride demanded anger, but wisdom asked for restraint? Sundar's voice softened, filled with emotion now. "That night I did not understand. But years later, when I faced challenges, when I was doubted, when people questioned if someone like me could lead, I remembered my father's words, and I chose respect." The camera panned across the audience, faces showing quiet awe. In the front, Narendra Modi's smile grew deeper, not of amusement, but of respect. He knew the power of such teachings. He too had walked through hardships, guided not by wealth, but by values planted in the soil of simplicity. Then came the twist, something unexpected that no one had prepared for. Sundar leaned forward, his voice carrying a weight it had not before. "There was a day when I almost lost that respect. A day when I thought success gave me the right to speak without humility. I hurt someone close to me with my words, and my father, though old and weak by then, reminded me once again. He said, 'Son, the higher you rise, the softer your voice must become. Power without kindness is nothing.'" Gasps filled the room. People had expected inspiration, but not confession. Sundar was not painting himself as perfect. He was opening his flaws before them, showing that even he had to be corrected, even he had to learn again. And it was this honesty that struck like lightning. It was not the story of a CEO, it was the story of a son still learning his father's lesson. Narendra Modi closed his eyes briefly, his smile no longer just respect, but also recognition. When he opened them again, the softness in his gaze said it all. He understood. He had lived his own lessons, and now he was witnessing the echo of a father's wisdom carried into the heart of the world. The hall erupted in applause, but Sundar did not smile. He stood there quietly, allowing the sound to wash over him, knowing it was not for him alone, but for the lesson that belonged to every father, every child, and every heart that still believed respect was greater than power. The story had only begun, but already the audience was hooked. They leaned in, desperate to know what came next, to see how this simple lesson would shape the path of a man who touched the future, yet never forgot his roots. And so the journey began, of a boy, a father, and the lesson that would one day make even the Prime Minister smile with respect. The applause had faded, but the silence that followed carried even more weight. Sundar stood still, his eyes searching the audience as if he was not only speaking to them, but also to his younger self, the boy who once sat quietly in a modest home listening to his father's voice. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, his tone lower, almost like a whisper that demanded attention. "There was another day," he said slowly, "a day I can never forget. It was the day I first saw my father lose something important. And yet, he did not lose his calm." The hall stilled again. Everyone expected success stories, but Sundar was not giving them glitter. He was giving them truth. "I must have been 12, he continued. We had saved money for months to buy something important for the house. I watched my father count every note carefully, his hands worn from years of work. But then, on the way home, he realized he had lost it. The money was gone. I thought he would shout or break down, but instead, he sat down on the edge of the road, took a deep breath, and said, 'We will earn again. But if we lose our patience now, we will lose each other.'" The words lingered in the air. The audience felt the weight of it. Everyone had lost something once. Money, opportunities, moments, and yet not everyone had found the strength to hold on to patience and respect. Sundar paused, his eyes glistening with a memory that still lived in his heart. "I was too young to understand then. But as I grew, I realized strength is not in never falling. Strength is in rising again without bitterness." In the front row, Narendra Modi nodded slightly, his smile still gentle but now mixed with thought. He too had walked through such days, when money was scarce but dignity was held close, when patience was the only shield against despair. Then Sundar gave another twist, one that drew the audience closer. "Years later, when I sat in a room filled with people from around the world, each one powerful in their own right, I remembered that road where my father sat. I remembered the calm in his eyes. And I told myself, if I lose my calm here, I will lose more than any deal. I will lose myself." His voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the rawness of honesty. "So I chose to listen more than I spoke. I chose patience, even when I wanted to prove myself. And it changed everything. It made people see me not as competition, but as someone they could trust." The audience leaned forward. The suspense was no longer just about what Sundar would say, but about how these lessons shaped the man before them. He looked down for a moment, his silence louder than his words, then lifted his gaze again. "But it was not always easy. Sometimes I failed. Sometimes I spoke when I should have listened. Sometimes I reacted when I should have paused. And every time, my father's words came back to me. He said, 'Respect is not tested when people agree with you. Respect is tested when they disagree.'" The hall filled with murmurs of recognition. People remembered their own battles, arguments with family, conflicts at work, moments when anger had stolen their peace. And then Sundar added softly, "There was even a moment when I almost gave up. I felt I was not strong enough to carry the weight of expectations. I wanted to step away. But my father reminded me, resilience is not about never falling tired. It is about walking even when your legs shake, about believing even when the road looks empty." Narendra Modi's eyes softened, his expression now carrying a deep respect that went beyond politics or power. He was not just watching Sundar, he was remembering his own journey, his own struggles, the voices from his past that had kept him standing when the world had tried to push him down. Sundar exhaled slowly, as though releasing the memory into the room. "Today, when I speak here, I carry those lessons with me. They are not just my father's. They belong to anyone who has ever fought with nothing but dignity, anyone who has stood tall when life tried to make them bend." The audience erupted again, the applause thundering through the hall, but Sundar's face remained calm, humble, almost as if the claps were not for him but for the man who had once sat quietly by the road, teaching patience through silence. And in that moment, as the cameras captured Narendra Modi smiling with respect, the audience knew this story was not just about one man's rise. It was about the invisible strength passed from fathers to sons, from one generation to the next, shaping the world not with wealth, but with values. The suspense deepened. What other lessons were hidden in Sundar's journey, waiting to be revealed? The evening sun poured golden light through the tall windows of the hall, but the glow inside did not come from the fading daylight. It came from the story unfolding, a story that seemed to reach into every heart present. Sundar stood steady, his words carrying more than memory. They carried the weight of choices, mistakes, and the invisible bond between a father and a son. After the applause softened, he drew in a deep breath and spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "People often think success is a straight road, but my father always told me it is not. He said, 'Life is a path of stones and shadows. Some stones hurt when you step on them, and some shadows make you afraid to move forward. But if you walk with respect, the path will guide you.'" He paused, letting the words sink deep, and then leaned closer to the microphone. "There was a day when I almost let the shadows win." The room grew still. Every listener knew that moment in their own life, the moment when doubt felt stronger than hope. "I had applied for something important, something I had dreamed of for years," Sundar continued. "When I received the rejection, I felt broken. I thought perhaps those boys who mocked me were right, that I would never be enough. I stayed quiet for days, carrying shame like a stone on my chest. Then my father sat beside me. He said, 'Do you think your value is less because someone else cannot see it? A mirror cannot show the whole sky, but that does not mean the sky is small. Do not shrink yourself just because they do not see your size.'" The audience let out a soft gasp, the imagery powerful, simple, and unforgettable. Even Narendra Modi shifted in his seat, his smile touched with admiration. Sundar's voice grew heavier as he went on. "It was that night I learned resilience. I realized failure was not an end, but a test of how much I believed in myself. I promised my father I would try again, and even if I fell 100 times, I would rise 101 times, with respect, never bitterness." He stopped for a moment, his eyes fixed on the floor as though he was seeing the boy he once was. "But let me tell you the truth," he said softly. "Keeping that promise was not easy. There were nights I doubted myself, nights I thought of giving up. There were even moments I felt angry at my father's words because I thought they asked too much of me. But every time I stood on the edge of surrender, I remembered his eyes. Not strict, not angry, but filled with belief in me. And I could not betray that belief." The hall was silent. the kind of silence that comes when people feel their own emotions reflected back at them. Then came the twist, the unexpected turn that tightened the grip on every listener. Sundar lowered his voice, almost to a whisper. There was one rejection that hurt more than all the others. It came from a place I thought would be my future. I felt like I had lost everything. I sat in my room and cried, but then my father came in carrying 2 cups of tea. He placed one before me and said, "If this door is closed, then it is not your door. When the right door opens, you will know. But you must be ready to walk through it with humility, not pride." He lifted his gaze to the audience, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. And he was right. Years later, when the right door opened, I walked in with the weight of those lessons. I did not come with arrogance. I came with gratitude. And that gratitude shaped how people saw me. Narendra Modi's eyes glimmered now, his smile filled with quiet respect. He had built his own path through countless closed doors, and he understood the truth of those words. Sundar let the silence hold once more before adding, "The truth is, we all face rejection, but what we carry in those moments decides our future. Anger closes hearts, respect opens them, and sometimes the very people who once doubted you become the ones who stand by your side because you did not answer their doubt with hatred." The audience broke into applause again, but this time it felt different. It was not loud thunder. It was steady, rising, heartfelt, as though people were clapping not only for Sundar, but for the fathers, mothers, and teachers in their own lives who had given them the strength to keep walking. And through it all, Sundar remained calm, his expression thoughtful, as if the story was still unfolding inside him, waiting to be told in full. The hall was alive with quiet energy. The audience no longer felt they were listening to a CEO of the world's biggest company. They felt they were sitting in the small living room of a modest Indian home, listening to a boy's father speak truths that could guide any life. Sundar's voice carried the weight of generations, and each sentence seemed to light a memory in the hearts of those listening. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the faces, and then he spoke again, his voice steady yet touched with emotion. "My father once told me something that I did not fully understand as a child. He said, 'The most dangerous thing you can lose is not money, not position, not even health. It is respect for others. Because the moment you stop respecting others, you begin to lose yourself.'" The words cut through the silence like a blade through glass. Many in the room shifted, remembering times when they had been tempted to look down on others, or when they themselves had been disrespected. Sundar let the weight of those words sit for a while before continuing. "When I started my career, I was young, eager, and sometimes too quick to speak. I thought knowledge was enough, that intelligence was everything. I remember one meeting where I spoke over someone older, someone who had years of experience. I thought I was showing confidence, but in truth, I was showing arrogance. When I went home that evening, I told my father proudly about how I had made my point. He did not smile. He looked at me quietly and said, 'You may win an argument, Sundar, but if you lose respect, you lose the person.'" The audience stilled again, many nodding, their eyes heavy with the truth of that statement. Sundar lowered his gaze, his voice softer now. I felt ashamed that night. I realized my words had silenced someone who deserved to be heard. The next day I went back to that colleague and I apologized. It was not easy. My pride resisted, but my father's voice guided me. And you know what? That man became one of the strongest supporters of my journey. Not because I was perfect, but because I chose respect over ego. Narendra Modi smiled, his head tilted slightly, as though he too knew how hard it was to choose humility when pride whispered louder. It was a smile of recognition, not judgment. Sundar went on, his tone deeper now, his words wrapped in suspense. "But life does not stop testing us. There came a time when I was leading a team much larger than I had ever imagined. Pressure was high, mistakes were made, and anger burned inside me. One evening, I raised my voice at someone. I thought it was leadership. But when I returned home that night, I saw my father sitting in his chair, his eyes tired but calm. I told him what had happened. He listened, and then said only one sentence. "A leader who cannot respect the smallest voice is not ready to lead." The audience gasped softly. It was not just advice, it was a warning, a mirror reflecting the hidden flaws of power. Sundar looked down for a moment, then raised his eyes again. That night, I did not sleep. I thought about how easily power can make us forget respect. The next day, I met the person I had shouted at, and I apologized. I told them I had been wrong. It was not weakness, it was strength, because respect is never weakness. The hall erupted into applause, long and strong. Many in the audience felt their own hearts stirred, remembering their own mistakes, their own moments when pride had stolen their kindness. Then Sundar delivered the twist, his voice carrying a secret the audience had not expected. Years later, when I stood in front of a crowd larger than this one, someone in the audience raised their hand and said, "We respect you because you respect us." And at that moment, I realized it was my father's words speaking through me, not my own. I was only carrying forward what he had planted. Narendra Modi's smile grew warmer, almost like a silent agreement, as if he too had carried words from elders through his journey, words that shaped how he led, how he lived, how he inspired others. The hall was no longer just a hall. It was a place where respect was reborn in every listener's heart. The night outside had grown darker, but inside the hall the atmosphere burned with light. Not the glow of lamps or cameras, but the glow of emotions stirred deep within every listener. Sundar's voice had carried them through memories of rejection, patience, and respect. Now, as he looked at the audience again, there was a pause. The kind of pause that made everyone lean forward, waiting, knowing another truth was about to unfold. His voice dropped lower, softer, almost like a confession. "My father once told me," Sundar began slowly, "that kindness is the greatest form of respect. He said, when you show kindness to someone weaker, you do not lower yourself. You rise higher than you will ever know." He looked away for a moment, as if the memory hurt, then returned to face the crowd. I must admit, there was a time I forgot this lesson. A time when the weight of work, the speed of decisions, made me forget to see the person behind the task. I was focused on goals, deadlines, results. I thought kindness was a luxury, but I was wrong. The audience shifted in their seats, the suspense tightening. Everyone knew what it meant to get lost in work, to forget the human faces around them. One evening, Sundar continued, a junior employee came to me with a mistake they had made. It had cost time, effort, and resources. I was tired, frustrated, and I almost spoke harshly. But then, for just a moment, I remembered my father's voice. I stopped myself. Instead, I said, "Mistakes can be fixed, but if I break your spirit now, it may never heal." I chose kindness. That person later told me it gave them the courage to keep trying, to grow stronger. The hall fell into complete silence. Sundar's words were not just stories. They were reflections of choices every person in the room had once faced. And then he added the twist, his eyes dark with memory. "But let me tell you about the day I failed. There was a man working quietly in the corner of the office, someone no one noticed much. One day I walked past him without even looking, too lost in my own thoughts. Later I learned that he had been struggling, that he had needed support. I had missed my chance to be kind, and it haunted me." The audience inhaled sharply, the weight of regret filling the space. Sundar's voice cracked slightly, honest and raw. "I realized then that kindness is not something you give only when it is convenient. Kindness must live in you, so it flows even when you are tired. even when you are busy, even when you think no one is watching, because sometimes the smallest kindness is the only light someone has left. Narendra Modi's eyes glowed with respect, his smile deeper now, touched with understanding. He knew the burden of leadership, how easy it was to forget the simple gestures that mean the most. His smile was not just respect, it was empathy. The audience began clapping, slow at first, then louder, until the hall echoed with it. Some clapped with tears in their eyes, others with a heaviness in their hearts. They were not clapping for success, they were clapping for the reminder of something they too often forgot. Sundar raised his hand gently, asking for quiet, and continued, his tone filled with gravity. I tell you this because success is not only about building something great. It is about how many people you lift along the way. It is about leaving behind not just achievements, but kindness that echoes through the lives of others. His words settled like a seed in the soil of every heart, ready to grow. The hall had grown so quiet that even the soft hum of the lights could be heard. Sundar stood tall, but his eyes carried the weight of memory. He had spoken of patience, respect, resilience, and kindness, each one like a stone placed carefully on a path his father had once shown him. Yet the journey was not finished. There was still a deeper truth, one born not from ease, but from pain. He took a slow breath, his voice calm but edged with emotion. My father once told me something I never understood until much later in life. He said, "Strength is not in how much you can carry. True strength is in how much you can let go." The audience shifted. Many frowned slightly, not yet grasping the meaning. Sundar let the words hang before he explained. For years, I carried every rejection, every insult, every moment of doubt like a wound inside me. I wanted to prove people wrong, to show them I could rise above. And yes, I rose. But I carried bitterness with me, hidden in my heart. One day my father noticed it. He looked at me quietly and said, "You cannot hold bitterness and kindness in the same heart, son. You must choose which one you want to grow." The hall went still again. Narendra Modi leaned forward slightly, his face calm, his eyes soft. He too had known what it meant to let go, to forgive those who once doubted or opposed him, and to carry forward without anger. Sundar's voice grew heavier. There was a time when someone close to me betrayed my trust. I felt anger like I had never felt before. I wanted to cut them out of my life forever. But then I remembered my father's words. It took me days, weeks, even months, but I chose to forgive. Not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. He paused, his eyes distant, his voice quieter. Forgiveness does not erase the hurt, but it frees you from becoming a prisoner of your own pain. My father knew this long before I did, and when I forgave, I felt lighter. I realized then that the strength to forgive is greater than the strength to fight. The audience held their breath. Some had tears in their eyes, others nodded slowly, their own memories surfacing, moments when forgiveness had been too hard or when bitterness had chained them for years. Then Sundar shared the twist, something unexpected. Years later, when I was in a room full of people, one of the very same who had once doubted me stood and said, "We are proud of you." I could have reminded them of their words, I could have shown them their mistake, but instead I simply smiled and said thank you. In that moment, I understood my father's lesson. True respect is not earned by proving others wrong. It is earned by forgiving them and moving forward. The hall erupted with applause, long and thunderous. The words had pierced deep, not only as inspiration, but as a challenge to everyone present, to let go, to forgive, to live lighter. Sundar raised his hand gently to quiet the clapping, and added one final line for this part, his voice carrying both humility and strength. My father taught me that dignity is not in how high you climb, but in how lightly you carry your heart as you rise. I am still learning this every day. Narendra Modi's smile widened, his eyes glowing with a respect that came not from politics or position, but from the recognition of a truth that shapes real leaders. It was the smile of a man who had lived his own version of that lesson, and who now saw it alive in Sundar's journey. The hall was silent, but it was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of hearts held in a single rhythm. Sundar had shared lessons of patience, humility, resilience, kindness, and forgiveness. Each word had carried the weight of lived truth, yet everyone could feel it. There was still one final lesson, one last truth that would complete the circle of his father's wisdom. Sundar's eyes softened, and for a moment his lips trembled before he spoke. The last lesson my father gave me did not come in words, he said, his voice lower than before. It came in silence. The audience leaned in. Suspense filled the air. Narendra Modi sat still, his expression calm but deeply attentive. Sundar drew in a slow breath, remembering. My father was a man of few words. But in his final days, when his body was weak and his voice could not carry any more, I sat by his side. I wanted him to speak, to give me something, one last teaching. But he only held my hand. He looked into my eyes, and in that silence, I understood what he had been teaching me all along, that life is not measured by the noise you make, but by the peace you leave behind. A wave of emotion rippled through the hall. Some eyes filled with tears. Others bowed their heads, remembering their own fathers, their own mothers, their own mentors, whose last lessons had come not through speech, but through presence. Sundar's voice grew steadier, though his eyes glistened. In that moment, I realized that respect is not just something you give, it is something you live. Humility is not just how you speak, but how you carry yourself when no one is watching. Resilience is not just about standing again, it is about walking with hope, even when you know the road will be hard. And kindness. Kindness is not an act. It is who you become when you refuse to let the world harden your heart. The audience erupted into applause, but Sundar did not stop. His voice rose slightly, filled with a quiet passion that shook the silence once more. I stand here not because I was the smartest, not because I was the strongest, but because I had a father who taught me that respect, humility, resilience, kindness, and forgiveness are worth more than any success. If I carry anything into the future, it will not be titles or positions, it will be these lessons, because in the end, that is all that truly remains. The applause grew louder, thundering across the hall. People stood to their feet, clapping not just for Sundar, but for every father, every mother, every teacher who had planted seeds of wisdom in silence and sacrifice. And as the cameras captured the moment, Narendra Modi smiled with a depth that words could not capture. It was not the smile of a leader on stage. It was the smile of a man honoring another man's journey, a recognition that respect and humility build stronger bridges than power ever could. Sundar bowed his head slightly, his eyes wet, but his voice steady as he gave his final words. If I could give one message tonight, it would be this. Whatever you become, wherever you reach, never forget to walk with respect, because respect is the only wealth that grows the more you share it. The hall shook with applause, but Sundar did not raise his hands in victory. He stood quietly, humbly, carrying the silence of his father within him. And in that silence, Every listener felt something awaken in their own hearts. And so the story ended, not with grand triumph, but with the simple truth of a father's lessons, truths that would live on, long after the clapping faded, in the lives of those who chose to carry them forward.